Thank you. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. I'm very glad to be here. This is my second visit to Little Rock. I was here about 15 years ago. I had a very nice time when I was here in the 1990s, and it's good to be back. Well, the field of women's history is a relatively new field. Most of the scholarship has appeared in the last 40 years, and most of the scholarship on Southern women came out since the 1980s. The scholarship on Southern women and the Civil War is even more recent, dating for the most part from the 1990s. And despite excellent work by a number of scholars, we still need to know more about women's experiences during this mighty conflict. We know already that the war deeply divided the white population, including Arkansas. This state, as most of you know, did not secede until after Fort Sumter. It always had a large Unionist population. And we know that many white women all over the South, including Arkansas, began running farms and plantations when the menfolk left to serve in the military. We know that the military campaigns disrupted the agricultural economy, the impact growing worse every year. We know that the war created a large refugee population of civilians who moved from place to place trying to get away from the war. We know that the war presented the slave population with unprecedented opportunities to escape bondage. Runaways started leaving farms and plantations long before Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862, heading for Union troops and army camps. And when federal troops entered Arkansas, that inspired thousands of fugitives to leave their farms and plantations seeking a new life. We know that thousands of black Southerners worked for the Union Army in a variety of capacities, as cooks, as laundresses, as couriers, as gravediggers. And when the U.S. military allowed blacks to begin serving in 1863, thousands of them volunteered. But we need to know more. For example, the Unionist population. There were always white Southerners who were against the war. They voted against it in 1860. They did not want to serve in the military, and this, we think, is at least a third of the white Southern population, but we know almost nothing about them. There's been very little scholarship about Southern Unionists. We also need to know more about the war's impact on the physical landscape, on the disease environment. These are subjects that have hardly been touched by historians. We're just now finally getting some articles and books about these important subjects. We need to know more about the several thousand women who disguised themselves as men and managed to serve in the two armies. We think it's probably 2,000 or 3,000 people. We need to know more about their experiences, their perspectives, how they remember the war. We need to know more about the complexities of the Union occupation, interactions between soldiers and civilians, and that would include civilians, white and black. For example, federal troops occupied the northern half of Arkansas by the spring of 1862 and most of the state by the end of 1863. And we need more scholarship on what all those interactions were like. Fortunately for historians, the documentation on women, white and black, is enormous. The archives and the libraries are filled with thousands of diaries and letter collections. The Arkansas History Commission, right here in town, has many splendid manuscripts on women's history. I was just doing research there today. They have wonderful holdings. Government records, such as the quartermaster records, court-martial records, are very rich. So are the interviews that were done with thousands of ex-slaves in the 1930s, the so-called WPA narratives, which are now in print, and many of them, in fact, are available online. And there are hundreds of memoirs by the war's participants, white, black, male, female, pro-Union, pro-Confederate, and in the middle. Which brings me to my biography of Verena Howell Davis, the wife of Jefferson Davis. First of all, her name is pronounced Verena, rhymes with Marina. She spelled it phonetically in one of her letters after the war. She said it was irritating the way people kept mispronouncing her name. And she spelled it V-A-R-E-E-E-E-E-N-A. And this is a name that you don't see too much anymore. It's an unusual name, but it was popular in the early 19th century. And these are the principal themes of her life: the the big picture. Her regional identity was divided. Her father was from New Jersey, and her mother was from Virginia. Her father's father was the governor of New Jersey in the late 18th century, a Revolutionary War veteran who served with George Washington and was personal friends with Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Her mother's father was an Irish immigrant, and Verena herself often called herself a half-breed. You know, that's a quote, a half-breed, with both northern and southern relatives. Another theme, she was forced into a role, Confederate First Lady, that she was not really suited for by virtue of her family background, her education, her temperament, even her physical appearance was wrong, as we will see. Another theme, she was the second wife, the second much younger wife of Jefferson Davis, and she always felt that she was in his shadow. And she said in 1889 that her husband had always loved his first wife, Sarah Knox Taylor, more than he loved her. She led a long life. She was born in 1826. She died in 1906. That's a long life by 19th century standards. She led a life of surreal contrasts, and she spent much of her life after 1865 trying to understand what had happened to her, you know, trying to come to terms with her own experience. And she finally said in a newspaper article in 1901 that it was God's will that the North won the war. I got interested in her story when I was working on my first book many years ago. I came across some of her correspondence, and it was very well written. And I'm not talking about her handwriting. I'm talking about the way her mind worked. She was highly articulate. She was an excellent writer. And I made a mental note to myself. I thought, you know, well, I'll come back to her. You know, maybe there'll be some material for an article or maybe a book. You know, it seems kind of laughable now. I was actually worried, would there be enough material for a book? Well, I found out there was an immense amount of material, and I think that's one reason why other historians haven't done books about her. I think the sheer documentation on her life scared people off. She wrote about 600 letters, and she received approximately 2,400. So the total direct correspondence by her or to her is 3,000 letters. And there are several thousand other letters that mention her. She's in the newspaper much of the time from the 1850s, when her husband becomes a powerhouse in the Democratic Party, until her death in 1906. Her family and she herself was involved in 2 major lawsuits after the war, and lawsuits always generate documentation. She knew many other famous people. She knew Frances Willard. She shows up in Frances Willard's memoir. She knew Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde mentions her and her husband in his correspondence. So it became clear that there was plenty of documentation to write this book. Her story begins in the Mississippi River Valley. She was born near Natchez, Mississippi in 1826. She was the daughter of a merchant, William Howell, who had moved to Mississippi after his service in the War of 1812 in the 18 teens. And there he met and married Margaret Kemp, who was the daughter of an Irish immigrant who had lived in Virginia for a time and then had moved to Mississippi, also in the 18 teens. And her father, William Howell, did well for himself for a time. He was pretty successful. He bought a nice house in Natchez, which is still standing. He owned some house slaves, we think at most 12 at the peak of his prosperity. But he was never a planter or a plantation owner, and he went bankrupt in 1837, and he went completely under. An economic crisis swept the whole country in 1837. Many people went bankrupt. William Howell went under completely. He lost everything. The furniture was auctioned off on the front porch of their house, and one of their relatives had to buy their furniture back. And then another one of their relatives bought the house so they would literally not become homeless. And her father never rebounds after that. He seems to have been sort of psychologically damaged by the experience, and the family lived off of the charity of their wealthier kinfolk after that time. So Verena Howell was not part of the plantation gentry. She grew up in the city. She was a merchant's daughter, and she was never a proper Southern belle. And if you think about the stereotype, you know, the Southern belle is idle. You know, she's passive. She's supposed to represent the family's wealth. And Verena Howell's family was not rich. And the same is true for Southern ladies. You know, they are also idle. They don't work. Other people work for them, but they don't work. And Verena, as a teenager, learned how to work. She was the oldest daughter. She had 5 brothers and sisters. She learned how to cook. By all accounts, she was an excellent cook. She learned how to sew. She became a very accomplished seamstress. By the time she was a teenager, she was making all the clothes for her little brothers and sisters. And the role of Southern Belle doesn't take with Miss Howell for other reasons. She's highly verbal. The whole family is that way. They were big talkers. They were highly articulate people. She was outspoken. She was also very well read. She loved books. Her mother was a great reader. She had a private tutor when she was a girl for a time, you know, paid for by one of her relatives. And she went to boarding school in Philadelphia, that too paid for by one of her relatives. So she's unusually well educated for a white woman from her background. And she's also considered unattractive by the standards of the Old South. She has an olive complexion. And in this society, a lily white complexion, porcelain white, is considered attractive and feminine. And she's got dark skin. And also, until she became a mother, she was very, very thin. And you know, thin is good now. You know, the world we live in today, you know, thin is good. Well, in the early 19th century, that was considered to be kind of unhealthy looking. And you know, a more curvaceous look was what men were attracted to. So there are no suitors for Miss Howell when she's a teenager in Natchez. And she has her father's scandal, you know, hanging over her head all the time. Her father went bankrupt. So the young men of Natchez are not beating down the door to propose marriage to Miss Howell. Then she met Jefferson Davis at a Christmas party in 1843. She was visiting, she'd been invited by his older brother to this Christmas party. Jefferson's older brother, Joseph, was friends with her father, and she apparently fell in love with him at first sight. She fell head over heels in love with him. He's older, he's in his 30s, he's just about old enough to be her father. He's tall, he's rich, he's very well dressed, he's considered very handsome by his contemporaries. You know, personally, he doesn't do anything for me. I don't get that. You know, standards of physical attractiveness have changed since the 19th century, but lots of his female contemporaries think he is very good looking, and it shows up over and over until, you know, he's well into middle age. Women will say, oh, he's so handsome. Oh, he's even better looking in person, you know, when you see him in person. And she thinks that he's very handsome. And she falls madly in love with him. She's a 17-year-old girl. She falls in love with him with all the passion and intensity of a girl of that age. And he fell in love with her probably because she was young and spirited and well-spoken. And they got engaged a few weeks later, and they got married in 1845. Then she begins to find out that they are very different people. They are very different personalities. He's quite conventional. Jefferson Davis is very much a man of the 19th century. He wants a traditional marriage and a submissive wife. He wants his wife to subordinate herself to him. She wants a partnership, you know, something that historians might call companionate marriage. Well, he doesn't want that and finds that those ideas to be threatening. And they have some angry arguments, some very stormy arguments about the in-laws, about money, about how she is supposed to subordinate herself to him. And when he was elected to the U.S. Congress in the 1840s, he once left her in Mississippi to punish her. He left her there, you know, for several months rather than taking her with him to Washington to let her know, you know, who was in charge and who's running the marriage. And she gives in, you know, she knuckles under. She really doesn't have too much choice. Divorce is not an option for people in this generation. At any time, divorce is considered a terrible scandal that besmirches both parties, ruins the reputations of the families involved. If Jefferson Davis had gone through a divorce, he never would have served in the U.S. Senate or Franklin Pierce's cabinet, much less been the president of the Confederacy. And the grounds for divorce in Mississippi are very specific. Desertion, non-consummation of the marriage and perpetual drunkenness. Yeah, and Jefferson Davis took a glass of whiskey sometimes, but he wasn't a heavy drinker, and the other grounds do not apply. So this is it. And if she's going to be married to him, she has to subordinate herself to him. And the reward is she gets to go to Washington. And she finally goes there in the late 40s after they have been through this transition period about the marriage, and she loves Washington. She enjoys it very much. She's from a city. She always liked cities. She made many friends in Washington, friends from all parts of the United States. And she's in Washington most of the time from the late 1840s until 1861. Her husband served in the House. He served briefly in the Senate, then he served in Franklin Pierce's cabinet as Secretary of War, and then he was back in the Senate. And they go home to Mississippi usually twice a year for short visits. And she's very, very happy and fulfilled in Washington. She has differences with him. She thinks that he's too rigid and uncompromising on some of his political stances. She once said years later that her husband did not have the arts of a politician, which to her meant compromise. Also, she does not agree with his hardline views on slavery. He compares slaves to livestock. He said one time in a speech on the floor of the Senate that he had no more fear of his slaves than he did of his cattle, echoing the opinions of lots of people in the 1850s that slaves are not quite human. Well, she said in the early 1850s in a letter to one of her relatives that, quote, slaves are human beings with their frailties, close quote. And the context was somebody had punished a slave on the plantation, and she thought the punishment was too harsh. And she said, he's young, he shouldn't have been punished like this, and slaves are human beings with their frailties. That's her only generalization about slaves before the war. And of course, she's not a plantation mistress for very long, at most, maybe a month or two a year. She's in Washington most of the time. Now, her husband in the 1850s got more and more powerful. He becomes the leader of the states' rights wing of the Democratic Party. He's more and more outspoken, more and more blunt on the chief issues of the day. He's saying repeatedly that slavery must be allowed to go west, that slavery should expand all over the Western territories if that's what slave owners want, that slaves are private property, that slavery is protected by the Constitution. He says it's endorsed by the Bible. He's articulating all of the views of the 1850s, and he's more and more powerful inside the Democratic Party. And in 1860, even though he doesn't run for election in the presidential race that year, she knew that people were talking about him as a possible head of a new government if the anti-slavery politician running that year, Abraham Lincoln, if he won the election. And she said to a friend of hers in Washington in 1860 that if the South secedes, the whole thing is bound to be a failure. If she could have voted, she would have voted for the pro-Union Southerner who ran that year, John Bell, the United States Senator from Tennessee, who ran for president precisely because he was so alarmed by what secessionists were saying. But of course, she can't vote. He votes, Jefferson votes, he votes for John Breckinridge, the hardline pro-secession, pro-slavery candidate. But Lincoln wins, obviously. The state starts seceding. Jefferson Davis resigns from the U.S. Senate, goes home to Mississippi, and they're in Mississippi in February of 1861 when he is chosen to be the Confederate president. And she goes to Montgomery, because that's the first Confederate capital, and she's married to him, she has to go with him. And then when they move to Richmond, when Richmond becomes the Confederate capital, she must go with him. He makes the choices and she is supposed to accommodate. And when she becomes the Confederate First Lady, from the very beginning, she has a hard time keeping her views to herself. She thinks this is not a good idea. She thinks this is not going to work. For practical reasons, she told her mother in a letter in the summer of 1861 that the South did not have the resources to win the war. And she loves her mother very much, and she will say things in her letters to her mother that she will hardly ever say to anyone else. She said at receptions in Richmond that she missed Washington, that she missed her old friends. And she did correspond secretly with her friends in Washington and her relatives in the North during the war. There are at least 11 letters that we know that are very well documented that made it through, that were smuggled back and forth. She was corresponding with Mrs. Montgomery Blair. You know, Montgomery Blair is serving in Lincoln's cabinet. And his wife was one of her good friends in the 1850s. And one of the Blair cousins was in Richmond, and he hand-delivered letters. You know, he was passing them back and forth. Now, people notice that the First Lady is saying these things. You know, when the First Lady of the Confederacy says that she misses her friends in Washington, and she said at one point she had no ill will towards her friends in Washington, people will remember that. The rumors, you know, started to percolate through social circles in Richmond that the First Lady was corresponding with her friends and relatives, and it shows up in a diary by Mary Chesnut, who was one of Verena's friends in Washington, and she says, well, that just can't be true. Well, it was true. You know, she really was corresponding with her friends and relatives in the North. Also, her physical appearance is wrong. Again, you know, she has an olive complexion, which was considered unattractive. This is a slave society. People are very attentive to skin color and complexion. People called her a mulatto. They called her an Indian behind her back. She's very well read, and when she talks, you know, she will make literary references, and sometimes her peers understand what she just said, and sometimes they don't. And one time she got into this sharp exchange with the wife of a Confederate senator. She made a reference to a poem by an English writer, and this lady thought Verena Davis was talking about her, and she said, no, I'm not talking about you, I'm quoting a poem. And the other woman didn't understand what she was talking about and got offended. You know, so that sort of thing is often happening to her. She also has a keen sense of the absurd. You know, sometimes she'll tell a joke at a reception and nobody laughs but her. You know, she's really, you know, not a good fit. Her heart isn't in it. And people figure that out. People in Richmond sense that. And the Confederate elite is very attuned to any sign of dissent within. And she's married to him, and she's supposed to support the war effort. She did other unorthodox things. When Union POWs came to hospitals in Richmond, she nursed Union POWs. She also nursed Confederate POWs. She said in a letter to her husband in 1862, when McClellan's army was approaching Richmond and they thought that Richmond might be captured, he insisted that she and the children should leave, and they went to North Carolina, and they write back and forth to each other that summer. That's the only real sustained correspondence they have throughout the war. And she says in a letter to her husband that if the North wins the war, it is God's will. And she's also, you know, starting to think ahead, preparing for life after the war, and she said, I'll take a paying job after the war is over. You know, she's expecting that the old regime is going to be destroyed, you know, that the old way of life is collapsing. Now, sometimes she says the right thing. Sometimes, from the Confederate viewpoint, she contributed to a church charity in Richmond. She helped Confederate soldiers' wives find their husbands if they couldn't locate them in the many hospitals in the city. Some young ladies of Richmond once gave her a present at a reception, and she makes a very pretty little speech in reply, you know, thanking them for their gracious present, and so on. And she does have some friends in Richmond. She was friends with Mary Chesnut, the famous diarist, now a famous diarist. She was friends with Judah Benjamin, who was the plantation owner from Louisiana, who served in Davis's cabinet. She knew both of them before the war, and she got much closer to them during the war. But in general, the war is a very unhappy period for her, and she told a friend in early 1865 that the last 4 years had been the worst years of her life. In the 1880s, she said that the best years of her life had been when she was living in Washington before the war. Now, when U.S. Grant finally is closing around Richmond in the spring of 1865, the Davises flee. Jefferson insists that she leave with the children first. They left at the very end of March, and then he followed a few days later, and they travel by different paths. The original plan was that he would go to Texas and set up a new Confederate capital and keep fighting. You know, he's a true believer. He's gonna stick with it, Even though Richmond has been captured, he's gonna stay, in office as the Confederate president. And the plan was that she would go to the Florida coast, get on board a ship, and go to England with the children. And I think that they had money in the Bank of England, but I can't prove it. I think they had some money stashed away in two places, a bank in Montreal and a bank in London. And that was the plan. She was supposed to go to England, but of course the Confederate Party, they eventually come together and decide to travel together, which just slows them down. And eventually they get captured by some federal troops in May of 1865. And you may have heard about the longstanding controversy about what he was wearing when he was captured. And the stereotype that was created right away was that he was dressed as a woman when he was captured, which is not quite true, and it's not quite fair. They were asleep at the crack of dawn when they were surrounded by federal troops, and he was sleeping in his clothes, and he jumped up, and she threw a raincoat around him and a shawl over his head, and he tried to just quietly leave their little campground. They're by the side of the road in rural Georgia, and just slip away into the woods. And a U.S. soldier notices that that very tall person with the shawl over his head has on boots and calls out, stop or I'll shoot. And Jefferson Davis wheels around and he's pulling out his pistol. And she, Verena, ran over and threw herself in front of her husband's body and said, "Don't shoot." And she probably saved his life that day, although he didn't appreciate it. In fact, he later, in correspondence with one of his former staff members, blamed her for the fact that they were captured. I think that it might have been better if he had been killed in 1865. I really think that she would have been better off, and their children. And I also think that he really wanted a martyr's death. I think he really wanted to die for the Confederacy. And I think that if if she hadn't run out there, that he would have pulled his pistol out and he would have immediately been shot to death by at least one soldier, maybe more. But instead, they're arrested. He is put in Fort Monroe in Virginia. She's under house arrest for a while in Georgia. Then finally, she's permitted to leave Georgia. She goes to England and rather to Canada first, and takes the children there and leaves them there with some relatives she met in Canada. He's finally released from prison after 2 years because the U.S. government can't decide what to do with him. They move to England. He tries to set up a business, kind of a trading firm. That doesn't work out because he doesn't really know much about business. He's been a plantation owner for years. They come back to Memphis. He works for an insurance company. The company goes bankrupt. And then finally, in the late 1870s, a wealthy widow in Mississippi who felt sorry for him gave him a house, the House Beauvoir, which is where he lives for the last 10 years of his life. And that's where he died in 1889. And in 1890, Verena publishes a memoir of her husband. It's a big, fat book. It was obviously written very fast. It's a terrible book. Among the big, fat war-era biographies, it's one of the worst. It consists of, long, long quotes from his speeches and his writings. And she praises him and says he's a great man and so forth. But, that other voice breaks through as well. It's in this book that she says, which she also said in correspondence later, that her husband did not have the arts of a politician. She talked about how much she loved life in Washington, and she said that Northerners and Southerners had more in common with each other than they realized. So, she's done what she's supposed to do. She publishes this memoir. And then she immediately moved to New York City. In 1890, she's found an apartment in New York, and she lives there for the rest of her life. That's where she dies. And she got criticized a lot, as you might imagine, by the old Confederate elite. There were angry editorials, why is she living in the North, especially in New York City. And the city of Richmond actually offered her a free house to live in if she would move back to Richmond. You know, she could just have this house for free for the rest of her life, and she said, no, thank you. She supported herself by writing occasional articles for the New York World, the paper edited by Joseph Pulitzer. He was actually distantly related to Jefferson Davis through Jefferson Davis's grandfather. It's a long story, but they're distantly related. And Joseph Pulitzer really liked her. He liked Verena Davis, and he did this sometimes for people he liked. He would just give them a stipend of like $2,000 or $3,000 a year just to write for him, to write the occasional article. So that's what she did. She would write a couple of articles a year, and she got paid pretty well. You know, $2,000 or $3,000 a year was a nice income in the 1890s. And she likes New York. She really enjoys New York City. You know, she's a city person, and this is the ultimate city. She continues to do rather unorthodox things. She praises men in both armies for their bravery. She defended U.S. Grant when she thought a biographer had been too critical of him. She actually met Mrs. Grant, Julia Dent Grant, in New York, just outside the city. They met by accident at a hotel up the Hudson River. They both happened to be at this resort hotel, and they met and they liked each other, and they became friends. And they really were friends. You know, this wasn't a celebrity air kiss, I see you once a year kind of friendship. They were really good friends, and their children became friends, and they would have lunch together, and they corresponded, and until Mrs. Grant died in 1901. She has a stormy relationship, as you might imagine, with some of the Confederate veterans organizations and the UDC. They didn't like her friendship with Mrs. Grant, and that for obvious reasons. She would sometimes make appearances for the UDC and for the Confederate veterans organizations, but she also made public appearances for the GAR, for the Grand Army of the Republic, Union vets. And she continues to say things in print, in interviews. You know, she's still famous, and she still gets interviewed occasionally. She got an angry letter once from a Confederate cabinet officer who said that he had read in the press that she had said that secession was treason and the war was a needless tragedy. And she wrote back and she said, I did not declare that secession was treason, but I think the war was a needless tragedy. And she died in her apartment overlooking Central Park in October of 1906, and she was buried in Richmond alongside her husband and her children. So, what conclusions can we draw from her long, dramatic life? In the 19th century, for women, marriage is destiny. You know, his decisions shape her life, and as long as he's alive, she doesn't have very many choices, and she has to accommodate herself to what he wants to do. Regarding the war, I would venture to say that the whole thing probably was doomed to fail if she, of all people, is not on board. You know, if she is not an enthusiastic Confederate, because, you know, she's a woman and she's married to him, and she's supposed to be a true, enthusiastic, ardent Confederate, and she's not. Her biography also reminds us, I think, of just how complicated the war is, how many different stories are contained inside of the war narrative. An English scholar once remarked that war unleashes powerful forces that are unforgiving and unavoidable. It is the ultimate primal experience. And she spent most of her life after 1865 trying to come to terms with that, you know, trying to figure out what happened to her. And she finally said in public, in a newspaper article in 1901, that it was God's will that the North won the war. That's almost exactly what she said to her husband in 1862, except now she's saying it in a public venue. I also think that biographies are valuable, whoever the subject might be, because they make real the abstract questions about change over time, and they illuminate the immense complexity of historical change. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We do have time for a couple questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Yes, sir.
Was she on board with or consulted about the large funeral in New Orleans? Was she in favor of that?
You mean when he was temporarily buried in New Orleans before they moved his body? Yes, she was. But, excuse me, but, you know, for years before he died, people would write her letters telling her what should happen at the funeral. Yeah, I mean, the presumption of some of these people is just astonishing. You know, ex-Confederate generals would say, I want you to put my regimental flag in his coffin. And people would debate with her where he should be buried. But yes, she is consulted.
Yes, ma'am. I'll get to you next. Oop. I'll get you next, Annie. That's fine. That's fine. Either of them's fine.
Just wanted to know how great a role she played in the lives of her children and what their relationship was to her.
That's a great question, and I left out a lot of the material on the children. She had a very difficult time having the first child. She was married for some years before she finally conceived and gave birth to a living child. She apparently had several miscarriages. You know, she writes these anguished letters to her mother. You know, she doesn't understand what's going wrong. You know, I personally think it's probably because she was so thin. You know, she didn't really have enough body fat to promote fertility, and I also think it's because he's older. You know, he's not at peak fertility either. But anyway, they finally have a living child, and she has 6 children who live to adulthood, and she outlives all but one of them. Yeah, and it's unusual. I mean, in the 19th century, lots of people would outlive maybe 1 or 2 of their children, but the Davises seem to have had unusually bad luck, terrible luck. One of the boys died of the measles, one of them died of diphtheria, one of them died of the yellow fever, and one of them died, as I think some of you may know, of a freak accident. He fell off a balcony in Richmond during the war and broke his neck and died, a little boy. There are 2 daughters who live to adulthood, and the way it works out, the sort of psychological dynamics between the mother and the daughter, there's the good daughter and then there's the other daughter. And the other daughter is the one who outlived her mother. That's Margaret, the oldest daughter, who is very much her father's daughter. And they never really understand each other very well. And it's also very clear that the younger daughter, Verena Ann, whose nickname is Winnie, it's clear that she is the favorite. And you know, I have to say, reading their correspondence, it was sometimes painful just how obvious the mother was in her favoritism. You know, Winnie is the daughter who thinks like her, who loves to read. You know, they're a lot alike. Although poor Winnie kind of gets shunted off to boarding school. She was in Germany. Her parents put her there in the 1870s, and she didn't come home until she was a teenager. And so she's very worldly, she's very sophisticated, she's very well educated, and she's so well educated that I think a lot of men are intimidated by her. And she finally gets a marriage proposal from an attorney in Syracuse, New York, and it's a love match. You know, they're in love. And Jefferson Davis, this happened while he was still alive, he said, I'll never allow it, you know, and supposedly he said, death itself would be preferable. I'd rather die than have a Yankee for a son-in-law, you know. But then he kind of softens up and he says, maybe I might consent, and then he dies. He dies of pneumonia, and after that they get engaged, but then the engagement is broken off because it turns out that his father had been involved in a big banking scandal in New York, a big embezzlement case, and he seems to have misrepresented to Verena how much money he had and how much money he was making. So it's broken off largely at the mother-in-law's, the prospective mother-in-law's insistence. But I think the real reason is that she just can't let go. You know, Winnie is her daughter, and she just can't let go. And then Winnie dies when she's in her early 30s. She makes a public appearance somewhere. You know, she's also a celebrity in her own right. And she gets a terrible fever and she dies. And the other daughter, Margaret, married a banker, and they moved to Colorado because he had asthma. And most of the Davis descendants who are alive today live in Colorado Springs. Yeah, and a lot of them have hyphenated their names. You know, Hayes Davis, Hayes-Davis. A lot of them are attorneys and doctors. I've had some correspondence with them when I was working on the book, but they haven't contacted me since the book came out. So,
Yes, ma'am.
so.
There are two
Yes.
paradigms that I'd like for you to respond to as
Sure.
a historian. One is when we look at the attempt to try to pass ERA, do you think that is a part of a residue of that period? And the other, with the writings of this woman and many others, what is this paradigm of the computer age that we're in and our keeping of our own diaries? How will that impact history 30 years from now?
Wow, well, those are two great questions. The first one was about the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. Well, of course, that was long after Verena Davis died, and her statements on gender are they're not 100% consistent. I mean, for example, woman suffrage. She said in the 1890s, she got right up to the brink of endorsing it, and she said, maybe it's a good idea. And then a reporter asked her a follow-up question at another interview, and she pulled back. And she said, no, I don't think women should vote. But in her correspondence, especially with her friend Mary Chesnut, she talks about how unfair the world is to women. And it's clear that they think a lot alike about that. If she had been alive in the early 1980s, unless she had been born in another generation, I think she would have been a United States Senator herself. This is a big counterfactual assumption here. I've actually never thought of it quite this way, but I think that she probably would have been in favor of the ERA. And your other question was about?
With the technology we have now, and all of us have every way to record our thoughts, those are our diaries now. I just want to know how important is that going to be 50 years from now, 100 years from now, our diaries, which are going to be out there in outer space.
In the cloud, as that is called. Well, you mean how historians 50 years from now will address that question? That's another great question. The historians 50 years from now will be drowning in information about the private lives of millions of people. And many blogs are, in fact, I think, a form of diaries. And some of them are intensely personal, from what I occasionally see online. So I think that the internet may replace the old-fashioned diary, like, say, Mary Chesnut kept in her lifetime. Verena Davis apparently did not keep a diary. And I was always worried about that when I was doing my research, that there would be a diary out there and it would come to light after my book was finished, Yeah, because I found a loose piece of paper tucked into a book when I was doing research at the Museum of the Confederacy. They had the school books of the daughter Winnie. And I was just leafing through them, and a piece of paper fell out. And it was Verena Davis's description of the streets of Paris when she was there in the early 1880s, visiting her daughter. A marvelous vignette of, the hustle and bustle of the great city. And I was both thrilled to find that, and also my heart just sank. And I thought, this looks like this was torn out of something. The ragged edges, but there's apparently no diary. And at this point, I hope there isn't.
Yes, sir. One second. Hold on 1 second. We get that microphone to you. Thanks.
Let's get to the dirt. Can you mention, you did in the book quite extensively, Virginia Clay and their relationship to the Davises.
Have you read the book? Oh, you read the dirty parts. Okay, dirt. He wants me to dish dirt. Okay, infidelity. I think Jefferson Davis was unfaithful to his wife, to get right to the dirt. I mean, when they were in Washington before the war, he would often work late at the office and come home at 1 o'clock in the morning, which is unusual for a politician, even a Secretary of War. And I think that there may have been lots of fleeting, meaningless relationships with other women, but I think he really fell in love with Virginia Clay. And for those of you who haven't read the book, or maybe you read it a long time ago when it first came out, Virginia Clay was the wife of a professional politician from Alabama. Her husband served in the U.S. Senate before the war. He was in the Confederate Senate. And the two families end up kind of, their paths cross sort of by accident in Memphis after the war. And it's pretty clear to me from the surviving correspondence that he is really in love with her. And there was an incident on a train in 1871. That's what you want to hear more about, don't you? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Jefferson Davis was traveling alone by train, and the train going up to Baltimore, where he was going to meet his wife and his children, who were visiting friends and relatives in that area. Anyway, the night porter came around to get the ticket and noticed there was somebody else in Mr. Jefferson Davis's sleeping car, and said, well, she has to have a ticket. You only have one ticket here. And Jefferson Davis said something to the effect, based on newspaper accounts, this was in every newspaper in the country 4 or 5 days later. He said something to the effect, well, I don't have to do that. I can do whatever I want. So the night porter came back with another railroad conductor and insisted that either he had to buy another ticket or else this woman had to leave. So she got off the train at the next stop. And a few days later, it's in every newspaper in the country. She was never identified by name. I think it was probably Virginia Clay. But, until we get the videotapes, we'll never know. I think I should try maybe just for a moment or two to try to be fair to Jefferson Davis. He's a very conventional man. He's a man of his time and place. And his first marriage lasts for 3 months because his wife suddenly dies of a fever. And he was a widower for a long time, and he idealized the memory of his first wife. She was this unattainable angel in his mind. And that's how, he portrays that first wife to the second wife. And then when he marries Verena, I think he just got more than he bargained for. He just didn't really understand the way that she saw the world. Didn't understand that she was an unusual person in lots of ways. And he said to her once in a letter after the war, your letter to me, which I received last week, was so beautifully written. In another life, you could have been a novelist. Well, there were lots of women novelists in the 1870s. Harriet Beecher Stowe became rich and famous in the 1850s from writing a novel. So he just can't really think outside of the box. He's got very conventional ideas about gender, and he's a very rigid personality. And lots of people said that about him. His political contemporaries said that about him. And it's one thing I think that makes him rather unsuccessful as the Confederate head of state. He's just not very flexible and creative. But what that also meant is that, by the late 1850s, he seems to be the embodiment of the plantation elite. He seems to be, like the perfect representative of the plantation gentry. And that's why there's this mad rush to Jefferson Davis to be the Confederate president. There aren't even any real competitors. Nobody else is even seriously considered. And he seems to be the embodiment of the values of the plantation class, and in lots of ways he was. I mean, he could be very charming. People said that about him all of his life. One of his contemporaries from the Confederacy said to him after the war, remember, you can be very charming when you want to be. and he can, he does sometimes show beautiful manners. And he really does believe in what he's saying. You know, he believes what he says about the Constitution. He believes that it protects slavery. He believes that till the end of his life. But he's just not really cut out to be a head of state in a brand new country that is fighting for its survival from the very beginning. He just doesn't have extraordinary gifts as a politician to pull that off.
We have time for one more. Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
It's coming behind you.
You made a reference to her going to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Was that the community in Port Colborne founded by her Memphis friends?
They lived in Port Colborne for a while, and they lived in Montreal for a while. And there were Confederate sympathizers in Canada that they were glad to see. And then, of course, there was a miniature little colony of ex-Confederates who ended up in different parts of Canada.
You know, it's Tennessee Avenue. That's the name of that colony. My summer home is a mile from there.
You're kidding.
No, I'm not kidding.
Huh.
There's Stone Gate, you know, Stone Gate, and it's Tennessee Avenue along the beach. And it remained American until about 30 years ago, and now it's more Canadian occupied.
My goodness. I
Come
didn't know
visit.
that. Okay, I will. Thank you.
Well, thank all y'all for coming out this evening. The Arkansas Women's History Institute has some more information about Southern women or Arkansas women in the Civil War in the back hallway right here, if you're interested in that. We also have Professor Cashin's book over here, if you'd like to come get that signed and chat a little bit more. Thank you again, and we will see you at the next one.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.